Now, from CBS News Miami, this is Facing South Florida with Jim DeFede.
Welcome to Facing South Florida. I'm Jim DeFede, and later in the show I will speak to Marc Caputo, a longtime political reporter in Florida, about the Trump indictment and the impact on the presidential race. But we start with a new initiative to place the issue of abortion on the ballot in Florida during the 2024 election. As you know, the Florida legislature recently passed a 6-week abortion ban, and essentially that's an outright ban on abortion in Florida. A new group, the Florida Women's Freedom Coalition, is now collecting signatures to protect the healthcare rights of women by going back to the 24-week standard that was in effect for decades. This week I spoke to Anna Hochkammer, the Vice Mayor of Pinecrest and the Executive Director of the Florida Women's Freedom Coalition. I asked her about where we are as a nation 1 year after the Supreme Court overturned Roe.
I think on the ground, across the 50 states, we're seeing a greater division than ever before. You have states that have gone to constitutionally guarantee the access to abortion. You have states that have basically enacted total prohibitions on abortion. That's despite the fact that national surveys demonstrate time and time again that between 65 and 75% of Americans want abortion to be accessible, safe, and legal. They understand that it's part of health care for every family, every woman and girl in the United States. So a year after the overturning of Roe, we find ourselves living in a country where your ability to access healthcare, your ability to access sometimes life-saving services depends very much on geography. And so we are experiencing a time where living in a certain city or a certain state can have life or death differential outcomes for individuals in America. That is a really disturbing place to be.
I recently spoke to Florida's former Surgeon General, Scott Rifkes, just about his experiences in Florida. And one of the things that he said worried him overall in the country was that we're developing a system, very much what you're just talking about, where there's red state healthcare and there's blue state healthcare, as opposed to just healthcare. And that can get very, very dangerous. And in the South, in particular, Florida for the longest time was a sort of a safe harbor, a safe venue, at least before, when it was around the 24-week mark. And now slowly it's been regressed down to 15 weeks and 6 weeks. So pick up on that. Let's talk about where this fight is now in Florida and the impact here in Florida.
Well, there's no question that the almost total prohibition on access to abortion in the band of southern states just to the north of Florida has been felt inside the state of Florida, because we've seen over 5 figures increase in the number of abortions performed in the state of Florida since Roe was overturned. It means that people are traveling here from the region in order to get the health care that they need. There's absolutely no question that that's happening. What the consequences of the 6-week ban, which was signed into law earlier this year in Florida, was that safe haven, it disappears in this region of the United States. And at that point, we're talking about really long distances and expensive trips to fly to other parts of the nation in order to get that type of healthcare services. Now, like most of these issues, you have, red state and blue state, but you also have rich and poor. And there are segments of the country who can easily get on a plane and fly wherever they need to go and pay out of pocket for whatever services they need. They're going to be fine. But for most Americans and for most Floridians, it's not an easy lift to buy a plane ticket, to fly somewhere, to pay for a hotel, to pay for services with a doctor or a clinic you don't know, to have to recover from whatever medical need you've just had addressed, and then get yourself home while you're working, while you're raising other children, while you're taking care of other family members. So the consequences of this little change in healthcare policy will be felt in every single family across the state sooner or later, and probably sooner.
Well, let's be real clear, just so folks understand. We were at roughly 24 weeks. Then the legislature a year ago took it to 15, and then this last session took it to 6. But explain why the 6-week ban isn't in effect yet. Explain to me how this is going to work, because right now the law in Florida is 15 weeks while it's under review by the state Supreme Court.
Correct.
But pick it up from there.
The 15-week abortion ban was challenged by several groups in several different lawsuits, one of which was a challenge based on a religious freedom principle. That challenge to the 15-week ban is set to be heard by the Florida Supreme Court. They're either going to evaluate the 15-week ban and announce that it complies with the Florida Constitution, or they're going to reject it. The way the 6-week ban was written, it doesn't go into effect until the 15-week ban case is heard by the Florida Supreme Court and passes scrutiny of the court. So the minute the 15-week ban is signed off on by the Florida Supreme Court, it will become a 6-week ban, a de facto total ban on abortion in Florida.
Explain why you believe that's a total ban in Florida.
Listen, we use terms like weeks and months and viability all the time in pregnancy, but pregnancy and childbirth is a very gray area. The way you count pregnancy by weeks actually contains the first 2 weeks when you're not pregnant at all, because the only date that we're able to benchmark in a woman's reproductive cycle is the date that her last menstrual cycle began. Conception then happens actually 2 weeks or so after that. So by the time you're 4 weeks pregnant, you've actually only been carrying an embryo for 2 weeks. When you're 6 weeks pregnant, at the most, you actually have an embryo that's been gestating for 4 weeks. Most women at that point have no idea they're pregnant. They're still simply a little bit late on their period. In fact, most pregnancy tests can't detect pregnancy that early. So the idea that there is any window with which to seek care, with which to seek a termination in a 6-week ban environment is really, it's a false flag. It's a total ban when you put it into practice.
All right, so now you're part of a group that is working towards getting something on the ballot in 2024. Talk to me about that.
There's a really broad coalition of groups. Some of them come out of the reproductive health care movement. Some of them come out of the civil rights movement. Some of them are just groups of Floridians who are not ideological, but who understand that access to abortion is really important for the health and safety of women and their families here in Florida. So an initiative started. There's a petition circulating all over the state, very simple, straightforward language saying that the Florida legislature can't prohibit or penalize access to abortion before a viability or when it's necessary to protect a patient's health as determined by that patient's healthcare provider. It doesn't take away the legislature's capacity to require that notice be given to parents or guardians if a minor is seeking treatment. None of that. It's a very straightforward, simple language, nothing complicated. We need to get about 900,000 valid petitions signed from every corner of the state of Florida by December 31st, 2023, so that it can all be scrutinized and approved and ready to go on the November 2024 ballot, when we know that because it's a presidential year and because I think there'll be a lot of attention on Florida, we should have some tremendous turnout and see the will of the Floridian voter really register on that down ballot petition.
And Florida hasn't been alone in this. Kansas did this very similar thing, and voters in Kansas, which is a red state, came out in support of reproductive rights and in support of abortion. So I think, Florida, I think every poll I've seen shows that Floridians support a woman's right to be able to govern her own body. And yet the legislature passed this 6-week ban. Square that for me. Reconcile the fact that the legislature reacted and the governor is pushing one thing when all polling suggests that the people of Florida have a very different view.
Well, I agree. I think you're right. There's no question. 75% of Floridians reject the 6-week ban. The language that's in this petition guaranteeing access to abortion gets a 70% approval by Floridians in every poll that we've been able to run. It polls at over 60% approval with Republicans. It polls at about 57% approval, even with Trump voters. Florida is a state where access to safe and legal abortion is a general issue of consensus and unity. It doesn't matter where we stand on other issues or where we stand in a partisan scenario or ideologically. Now, I can't project myself into the Florida legislature's minds. I can't project myself into the governor's mind. I can assume that there is some strategy which doesn't necessarily involve representing the interests, preferences, and policy positions of actual Floridians and actual Florida voters. We are the fourth largest state. We have about 4 million women living here who are of reproductive age. And let's not forget, those women are parts of families. They're our children, our mothers, our daughters, our sisters, our friends. That means every single Floridian family is being disserved by the repeated initiatives to cut off access to what is fundamentally basic, important health care, which may be necessary in every family's life at some point or another. And so I encourage everyone who can to chip in to make sure that we can protect the health and well-being of women and girls across the state. Talk about this issue with your friends and your family. You would be surprised at how many people from different walks of life have had experiences with it and understand why it's important for the health, well-being, safety of Florida women and girls to have access to safe and legal abortion.
If you want to learn more about what they are doing, you can go to their website at FloridaWomen'sFreedomCoalition.com. Now, when we come back, we talk about Trump's Miami court appearance, his visit to Versailles, and the entry of Miami Mayor Francis Suarez into the Republican primary. Ooh, it's so exciting. Stay with us. Welcome back. Donald Trump spent a little more than 24 hours in Miami this week, a quick trip to plead not guilty to his latest indictment, make a stop at Little Havana on his way to the airport. Now, after the hearing, I spoke to Marc Caputo. He and I used to work together at the Miami Herald. He has also worked at Politico and NBC News and is now a national political reporter for the new news site, The Messenger.
What impressed me the most, or what really stood out to me, is we're used to seeing Donald Trump as this kind of larger than life character. He's the center of attention. He is at, or behind the Resolute desk when he was in the Oval Office as president. Here he was at the defense table as just kind of your everyday defendant, except of course he's not. He's a former president. And in this case, unlike the Donald Trump we know on the campaign trail or in the White House, or whenever he's speaking, he was totally silent. He was just subdued. He had his arms folded across his chest. He had his face bent with a serious scowl of a frown, not happy to be there. So that for me was just kind of sort of a jarring image when you're accustomed to seeing Donald Trump as that kind of bigger than life kind of alpha male, and he was put in sort of a totally beta situation. And I think it was notable that as soon as that ended, he just hightailed it out of there for Versailles restaurant, where he had a much different demeanor and a much different situation that unfolded there.
The way I sort of viewed the Versailles was, it was almost like he needed chicken soup for his soul. It
yes,
was like
exactly.
He needed, after going through the humiliation of being and the anger of being in court, he lives off of the adulation, the love of his supporters, and he needed a dose of that. Even if better than a shot of Cuban coffee was what they gave him in terms of going to that meeting.
Right, it was three things. So one, I talked to Michael Caputo, no relation to me, who was there and helped organize portions of it, and he talked about you could actually physically see Donald Trump kind of grow back into himself. Right, so as you're saying, it just gave him that warm adulation to wash off that sense of having been chagrined, humiliated, dragged in front of a court and a judge. The second thing it accomplished is he's still running in a Republican primary. Ron DeSantis is still the Republican governor who's running against him. And there's a possibility on March 19th, the two could square off for a real showdown in Florida. Well, what county is the most important county in terms of votes, in terms of population? It's Miami-Dade County. 72% of the registered Republicans in Dade are Hispanic. Almost all of them are Cuban American. So the symbolism of him going to the heart of the Cuban American community in Little Havana there, shaking hands with future voters and relatives of future voters shouldn't be discounted. The third thing is that these aren't just voters. These are potential jurors that might stand in judgment of him. So it's an opportunity also to kind of shape a jury in addition to shaping an electorate.
I would add one more to your list. It gives him the opportunity to align himself with the notion of this is a third world prosecution. This is what they do in countries like Cuba and Venezuela and Latin America. They go after their political opponents. And he even talked at Bedminster about how, this is what happens. I've warned about the country becoming Venezuela because of these sorts of things. And that resonates in this community. No politician ever goes wrong, exploiting the fears, the pain of the Latin American community fleeing dictators. Am I wrong?
That's true. I mean, it's interesting that the only Republican candidate running in the primary who's taking Trump on over this issue is Christie, the former New Jersey governor and former federal prosecutor, saying, look, you know what's a banana republic? Having your son-in-law and your daughter work in your administration in the White House, and then on the way out, your son-in-law winds up with $2 billion invested with him from the Saudis, whom he was talking to throughout the entire time that he was in the White House. But so far, Christie's the only one saying that.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about Ron DeSantis. You talk about how it could come down in the March primary in Florida to those two men. What is Ron DeSantis's path?
This is one of those things where it's kind of difficult to gauge a race because we have all of this national polling, which can be kind of meaningless because a presidential campaign is actually like 4 campaigns in sequence. Initially, it's Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Nevada. And it's a momentum game. The more people win or lose in one, the more the field changes drastically and the outcome changes drastically. So I don't know is the short answer. And I'm not sure the DeSantis team knows either. One of the things that they had told me when I was talking to them after the Bragg indictment, that's the Manhattan's prosecutor who charged Trump in connection with paying off hush money to a porn star, Stormy Daniels. Sometimes I have to pinch myself, remember that that's actually a real sentence that came out of my mouth. What you actually saw was Donald Trump's support levels increase, his ballot share, as they call it, increase in the Republican primary. And DeSantis has actually kind of nominally decreased. And DeSantis' team at the time was saying, look, this is just a sugar high. And so I said to him, well, what's going to happen when the federal indictment happens? Because it looks like he's going to be indicted in the classified documents case. They were having a wait and see approach. But they said, well, they still believed it was a sugar high. I said, well, what if there's an endless supply of sugar? And so far, we're seeing that. Now, again, these are national polls, but the Republican electorate is not that different between, say, Iowa and the rest of the nation. And we're not seeing any real decline of support for Trump. We're not seeing any real increase. So if that remains the case, and if this has no effect, what will? I don't know. And the DeSantis team doesn't know either. No one does.
I liken it to those YouTube videos where they keep putting rubber bands around a watermelon, and you keep adding another rubber band, another rubber band, another rubber band, hoping at some point, and then suddenly you put a rubber band on and the entire thing explodes. I think they're hoping that, a lot of these candidates are hoping a rubber band is him being found liable in the sexual assault case. The New York indictment, another rubber band. The federal indictment in Miami, another rubber band. Georgia, and as these kings get added, all of a sudden it won't be a little. It'll either just all implode or go or stay firm. And right now, Donald Trump seems to have a pretty hardcore husk for a watermelon.
Right. I mean, to your point, though, there are other rubber bands to come, but ultimately their hope is that people start to say this guy's not electable. And it's understandable because, national polling does show that people are really concerned about it. But at the same time, the Quinnipiac poll that was just released shows Joe Biden in a nationwide head-to-head contest against Donald Trump polling at 48% and Donald Trump polling at 44%. Considering the way the Electoral College operates within the context of the national electorate, which again, there's not really a national election, that's essentially a statistical tie. So it's difficult to make the argument that, Donald Trump is not electable because he's kind of electable in that poll. Yes, I understand it's a 4-point advantage for Biden. It's still, though, within the margin of error. And yes, maybe these other candidates are going to say, well, if we were running against Joe Biden, then things would be different. But there's a lot of ifs, ands, or buts there. And one of the instructive things in your language, you're talking about what these candidates are hoping. They hope for this, they hope for that. Hope is not a strategy.
Yeah, the DeSantis campaign folks that I talk to say they believe their next big moment is the debate stage. They in their mind believe that the debates will clarify things for voters, that you know, they often cite the primary debate against Adam Putnam, believing that was the turning point. They want to rewrite history, not that it was Donald Trump's support that brought him over the top, but it was his incredible performance as a conservative against Adam Putnam on the debate stage that propelled him to the victory. And I think if they started believing that Kool-Aid, I'm hearing them saying the same thing about what'll happen, you know, when we get to the debate stage, you know, in the next few months, you know, for the Republican primary. Again, I also remember DeSantis is not that skilled a debater. I remember the debates with Andrew Gillum and Charlie Crist. I'm almost be careful what you wish for. And also, last point I'll make, and then I'll turn it to you. Republican debates aren't about policy. They're often about sort of cutting people, you know, as quickly and as harshly as you can. And Donald Trump, there's no one better at it than maybe Christie himself.
Well, I was going to say, you know, they're talking about, oh, remember that debate against Adam Putnam? Yeah, Adam Putnam is not Donald Trump. Adam Putnam did not have the standing in the Republican Party that Donald Trump has. I don't think any Republican ever has. I mean, maybe Reagan, but I mean, you know, people call the hardcore Trump supporters, you know, he was the 45th president, cult 45. There is a serious cult of personality within the Republican Party, not all Republicans, toward Donald Trump. Just never seen that before. You know, and Trump has been on the big stage. He's been on the national stage. He went through a battery of these things in 2016. He debated Hillary Clinton. He did it against Joe Biden. Didn't do a great job against Joe Biden. Ron DeSantis hasn't been. And the reality is that Ron DeSantis has been living more and more in a bubble-wrapped political universe where he gets to pick and choose the media he's going to talk to. And by and large, not always, it's very friendly media, which kind of doubles as sort of a de facto in-kind contribution. He does take questions from the press, but they're usually at a press conference. They're usually filled with his own supporters that act as a Greek chorus to help amplify his message. So I don't know how battle-tested he's been in a while. I mean, he ran against Charlie Crist, and like Charlie Crist was like a pair of old shoes. That's just not Donald Trump.
So let's turn to the last candidate who entered the race on Thursday, Miami Mayor Francis Suarez. Your thoughts on how this will or will not shake up the election?
This will not shake up the election. I think it's a positive for Francis Suarez. The reality is that there's a part of our politics that's kind of a joke. And some people get to participate in the joke. I'm not saying Francis Suarez is a joke candidate, but I'm saying the joke's on you if you think that he's got a legitimate shot here. Some Republicans in Miami really hate Francis Suarez. And they're like, who does this guy think he is to think he's got a shot? Well, Francis Suarez is tricking them into believing that he believes that he has a shot. I don't think he believes that.
We'll be right back. Thanks for watching. We'll be back next week. Until then, enjoy the rest of your day.